Midnight Motorist, one of the most frustrating pieces of lore we've been given. Usually the FNAF community can mutually decide upon a few theories that would realistically work or be what Scott was probably trying to get across. But this minigame caused arguably some of the biggest confusion since the FNAF 4 box, and has since been left unsolved. Today we're going to dig deep into every detail we're given and see if we can finally solve who the orange and green guys are, who the two children are, why there are rabbit footprints in the backyard, what is this secret pile meant to represent, and the biggest mystery of them all, what is Junior's? Is it a location we've seen before or someplace new? Midnight Motorist is a minigame in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, the sixth main game in the franchise, which can be accessed and played through the arcade machine of the same name. Within the minigame, you drive a car and try not to get hit by other cars while gaining a higher and higher score. Although randomly, a hole will appear in the bottom wall, which if you go in, leads you into a more detailed minigame where as an orange man you walk around, finding a multitude of things such as a place called Junior's where a green guy tells you that you can't go inside, a hidden place containing simply just a pile of something in the ground, and a house containing a child watching television. And another child should be there, although after knocking on their door multiple times, you go around the back to figure out that he's gone, and the game ends. Digging further into the code of the game though, we learnt this minigame is called Later That Night, which helps us place this on the timeline as most likely after the death of Charlotte, aka the possession of the puppet. How did everyone get to that conclusion, since it could be later literally any night of this entire story? Simply due to the answer of our first mystery, who was the orange guy. The identity of the orange guy can be solved by simply remembering, who else have we seen colored like this without having a lore reason for being that color? William Afton, who has always been colored purple and has since been dubbed the purple guy, which coincidentally or not, the exact opposite of orange guy's color on the color wheel is purple. Another piece of evidence proving William is the Midnight Motorist is simply because the car that's used is purple, which may seem a bit on the nose, but we've seen the same purple car in the FNAF 2 minigame, which we know is the first time we saw William kill Charlotte, so we can comfortably place this in the timeline. This information helps us quickly answer a few other questions too, as it would make this William's house, this as Michael, due to the color code for his text being the same color code as FNAF 4 Michael's text, and also considering the nod to when we, as Michael, watch TV during Sister Location, that being the only other time a TV has ever been in FNAF besides once again being within the Afton house. And this would all most likely make the child who ran away the crying child, due to the heavy security we know is placed for the crying child, which would make sense if he keeps running away to a place like Fredbear's, a place which after this he forcibly gains a fear of. The placement in the timeline, the identity of the orange guy, his house, and the children inside are the only concrete and universally agreed upon theories that came from this minigame, that can't really be proven or make sense otherwise, although everything else diverges from here. First, the rabbit footprints can only be either Spring Bonnie, if he's heading or was lured to Fredbear's, or Bonnie, if he's heading or was lured to Freddys. These are the only two possible candidates for the footprints due to the timeline placement, and majority of the FNAF community agree it's probably Spring Bonnie's, although a question remains that not a lot of people try to answer. Not who, but why. Why are they there, and why are there no other footprints around it? As if the suit was just standing there. Well, is it possible that if this is Spring Bonnie, that William was indeed wearing it when these footprints were made, but was legitimately just standing there, looking through the crying child's window with the intention of scaring him from leaving again? We see that William is not surprised to see the suit footprints, and we do know from other games that steps have been taken to prevent the crying child from leaving, so would it be that far of a stretch to consider that William's done this himself? Before we try to answer the biggest and main question everyone has, we need to mention the hidden place within the minigame where there's a random pile of something in or on the ground. Now, this would most likely be a grave of some sort, or somewhere to put a body, but whose? Well, there are two possible candidates that would actually make some sense. The first being Elizabeth Afton, who we know, if the timeline that was a joint effort with the FNAF community is correct, dies while Fredbear's and Freddys are both still open, so everything would still work in timeline order. He could have discovered Elizabeth's body inside Baby, and then gone ahead and dug a hole to put her body near the house, and then continuing to scare the crying child away from the animatronics. Although another theory for the body is who we can only really call Mrs. Afton, aka William's partner and mother of the Afton children. The thing is, this could make sense timeline-wise, but we don't know hardly anything about the mother of the family. She could have died randomly, been killed, broke up with William, all the above, we won't ever know. Both Elizabeth and Miss Afton would make sense timeline-wise, and also also location-wise, being close to the family house. Now we have the possibilities for all the other questions out the way, we arrive at the two most confusing, frustrating, and simply difficult questions in this minigame. Who is the green guy and what is Junior's? Everyone's first initial thought, due to the timeline placement of this event, was that Junior's represented Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria, whether that's FNAF 2's Freddy's or not, and that the green guy at the front is Henry, Charlotte's father, sending William away because he either knows what he's done to Charlotte or because William's simply drunk or something. This theory is the most popular theory, although it lacks a lot of true evidence, really. But in its fairness, it could work perfectly fine and does fit, but I think the majority of people, including myself at the time, were simply overthinking it. I don't think green guy is Henry, and I don't think Junior's is a representation of Freddy's. How could this be? Why would Scott add not only a new character, but add a new location in what was meant to be the final game in this story? Well, that's simply because Green Guy isn't actually an important character, and neither is Junior's an important location. Hear me out. Junior's is just a random, unimportant bar, and Green Guy is either a bouncer / security or the bar owner. This bouncer simply tells William that he can't go back in, and to not make this a bigger problem than it is. Does this not sound to you like maybe William got drunk, caused issues inside of the bar, and then got kicked out for his behavior? Is it possible that after he got kicked out of the bar, he drove to Freddy's drunk, saw Charlotte on her own, and took his drunken anger out on her, killing her and then drunk driving at intense speeds back home, where once again getting out the car he slouched over, as body posture can be disbalanced while drunk, where he then continues to be angry, yelling at his kids. This would make sense. We've never ever been given a reason why William killed. What was his motive? What if Scott just gave us the answer but we never realized? He killed Charlotte because he was drunk and angry, and that might have made him feel some type of way, possibly gave him enjoyment or just made him feel better, that when he was eventually angry again by, let's just say due to timeline order, maybe his son dying, wanted to feel that way again and thus continued down his path of murders. What if Scott literally gave us the reasoning, or at least something to be hinting towards it, and we never even realized? So now that you have all the information and know all the different theories, what do you think is the truth of this minigame? The thing is, all of these theories can actually work, but Scott will never give us the concrete answer to which is the right one. So what is the random pile in the ground? Who is the identity of the green guy? And what is Junior's meant to be? And that is the unsolved mystery of Midnight Motorist. Today we're going to talk about the main theory within his video and what mine was going to solve. And that's about the rogue indie game developer, a piece of lore thrown at us that caused a lot of confusion to the point Scott Cawthon himself had to come out and make a statement about it, trying his best to debunk some theories. Although some fans were somehow still divided on what Scott was trying to get across with it. Ultimately though, the discussion went quiet for a while. Until recently, a new story within the Tales of the Pizzaplex series, and now thanks to a new game theory video saying FNAF 1, 2, 3, and 4 events didn't even happen, has reignited said discussion. Today we're finally going to put the nail in this coffin and debunk what some people claim to be the FNAF reboot, and answer the question, was everything before Help Wanted even real in universe? The indie game developer was introduced to us in Help Wanted, a man who went rogue and made video games based around the events and rumors of Fazbear Entertainment. So then Help Wanted was created to make fun of said games and basically discredit everything that they feature, framing the game developer as a lunatic. But this posed a question. Since they used an image of Scott Cawthon himself as the game developer, doesn't this mean that Scott is now canon in the universe? Meaning that all the FNAF games up to this point actually never happened, and this game is the start of the FNAF reboot? Well, that was the most popular theory 3 years ago, until Scott himself stepped in and intervened, and made a statement about the whole thing, immediately debunking that theory. Quote, "How do you take characters that are canon, along with characters that are questionably canon, and characters from every point of the timeline, and throw them all together in one game that is canon?" That's quite the problem when you think about it, but it was important for me that Help Wanted means something. I didn't want just a meaningless collection of minigames, although I'm sure most people would have been okay with that. I wanted it to be canon, and that meant that I needed to solve the substantial question of how. End quote. This statement gives us the answers already. The indie game developer storyline helps make this game canon to the main timeline, while featuring characters such as the Phantoms, Nightmares, and Easter egg characters that no one in Fazbear Entertainment would even know about, and some that might not even exist, and are simply just there for fun. Scott just needed a link between the past games and this game to make it canon, and be able to include Easter eggs without it automatically making the game non-canon. So the indie game developer storyline is exactly how he did that. I mean, come on, who wouldn't want Lolbit and to be canon? If our FNAF games were canon and they were the in-universe games, then that would mean Scott himself is canon. But earlier in the same statement, he says, "The short answer is no. My name is never actually mentioned in the game. Yes, I use my own picture for this indie developer because it's an obvious parallel. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually me in universe." This outright confirms that Scott Cawthon isn't canon in universe, meaning Scott Cawthon's FNAF games aren't canon in universe. The in-universe games and our real games are different. Scott debunked this himself. This is what the clarification post was about. We even know that there are some differences in the games, such as in Help Wanted, it's shown that the FNAF 3's location burns down in Night 5, within the in-universe FNAF 3. But we know in our real games that FNAF 3 burns down after Night 6/Nightmare Mode. That was all debunked 3 years ago, so why is it even a discussion anymore? Well, as always, the books. You probably heard this in Game Theory's video, but within the New Tales of the Pizzaplex book, HAPS, there's a short story called Help Wanted, which seemingly gives us some sort of an insight on the indie game developer. The thing is, MatPat used this as evidence that FNAF 1, 2, 3, and 4 are just video games in universe. They aren't real and the events within them didn't even happen. But doesn't it prove otherwise? The indie game developer is confirmed to have made and finished 3 games, but wasn't able to finish the 4th. This would help differentiate the in-universe games and our real games even more with what we know in Help Wanted. The sister location animatronics that we know from our real games are from the 5th game, are in the in-universe 4th game and 4th location. Sister location /FNAF 5 simply wasn't made within this universe, leading to them combining the stories together for the 4th and final in-universe game, as we see in Help Wanted. What doesn't make sense with this theory is that if FNAF 1 to 4 aren't canon, but Sister Location, Pizzeria Simulator, and Ultimate Custom Night are, then how come those canon games directly reference and talk about what happens in FNAF 1 through 4? Another thing that should be mentioned is the fact that within Security Breach, underneath the Pizzaplex, we straight up see the FNAF 6 location, further proving that we are still indeed in the same timeline as Scott's games. All the events did happen and do exist. The thing is, Scott has made fun of the dream theory multiple times before this, so wouldn't this be a complete 180? This is basically the dream theory 2.0, saying that all the events in games aren't real, and instead of claiming it to be a dream in universe, now claiming it to be video games in universe, but still the same concept that nothing ever happened. Scott wouldn't do this. 2 quick things that I want to touch on after watching the game theory video is that he says FNAF AR probably isn't canon, which it undoubtedly is. FNAF AR directly links and leads up to Security Breach with the Vanessa emails and the entire Lewis storyline. Check FNAF's video about why Lewis is important. Finally, he also claims that this all might mean that the animatronics aren't possessed, which we know is just not true. The animatronics are possessed. We literally see in FNAF 3 that when William destroys and opens up the FNAF 1 suits, spirits that were possessing the suits literally come out of them. Something else to prove that they are possessed is the ultimate guide, outright saying that the puppet is possessed, and reading the statement, one thing that seems certain, the animatronics themselves have been possessed by the spirits of the dead children, looking for revenge. This was originally just going to be about the indie game developer and FNAF's reboot rumor, but with Game Theory's video releasing the day I was going to release this video, I might as well go through some of his points and either agree or disagree with them. And unfortunately, I have to disagree with it, as it would completely break FNAF as we know it, and Scott debunked this exact idea 3 years ago. But either way, I would now consider the unsolved mystery of FNAF's reboot solved. The one you should not have killed, also known as the Vengeful Spirit and also as Golden Freddy, the one most likely keeping William in this seemingly endless nightmare we see play out in Ultimate Custom Night. But what is the actual name / identity behind them? This is what's caused a split in the theorist community, the discussion forever ongoing, everyone providing a multitude of evidence for their sides. Although it always dials down to 2 people, one side of this large debate arguing that it's Cassidy, while the other side arguing that it's Andrew. Today I'm going to show all the evidence for and against both sides of this argument, and then come to my own personal conclusion with the proof we have. So let's find out, who is the one you should not have killed? Let's start off with what we know about the one you should not have killed. Identity aside, we know that they possess Golden Freddy with the crying child, known thanks to the survival logbook. having 3 different people talking throughout it, one being Michael, most likely the crying child, and the one you should not have killed, whose connection to the survival logbook I'll explain later. And yes, 2 spirits within one animatronic can work perfectly fine, due to what we know in the Fazbear Fright series, as within the 4th Stitch Wraith Stinger, 2 souls are talking to each other within one body/animatronic. We also know it's not just the one you should not have killed in Golden Freddy, due to the fact that we know 2 spirits are released from Golden Freddy at separate points, one being in Happiest Day and one during Ultimate Custom Night. It's completely possible and most likely that it's the crying child who's also in possession, who possessed Fredbear after the bite of 83, and we know that Fredbear is the earlier version of who we know as Golden Freddy, proven thanks to Ultimate Custom Night, where upon trying to kill and or remove Golden Freddy from the night, Fredbear jump scares you instead, which shows they are directly connected. And since you can't kill Golden Freddy anyways, that further shows that Golden Freddy has to be in control of Ultimate Custom Night. Not to mention, we also have the final cutscene of the game to further prove that. To solidify the connection between the two, the one you should not have killed also has to be the one in control of Ultimate Custom Night, as we have voice lines that directly mention the one you should not have killed, which is how we got the name in the first place. But we also hear a voice behind some of the animatronics that's seemingly puppeteering what they say or do. The casting call for this voice is named Vengeful Spirit, so it's not Circus Baby that some people for some reason believe is behind the Mediocre Melodies voice lines. So if we've pinned this soul to Golden Freddy, we also know that the one you should not have killed was killed in the missing children's incident, and given life thanks to the puppet and give gifts. Finally, the gender of the one you should not have killed is something that is brought up way too much, honestly. But does anyone realize that doesn't actually change anything? Okay, before you get mad and claim that gender matters and further confirms the identity of the spirit, hear me out. There are 2 voice lines which call them a male, and the image of the spirit is confirmed to be Scott's son. But there's also 3 voice lines of the Vengeful Spirit's voice, outright being female. Speaking of those voice lines, the actual casting call for the one you should not have killed clearly states the gender should not be immediately clear. It should work as either a young boy or a young girl. So if it's confirmed that Scott was literally trying to cause confusion about the spirit's gender, why is that ever used for evidence for their identity? That's literally why we have 3 points for male and 3 points for female. He's intentionally trolling us like how he trolled us with Mangel's gender. So can we please agree that the one you should not have killed's gender does not matter and should not be used to further prove whether it's Cassidy a girl or Andrew a boy? So now that we can 100% pin the spirit to Golden Freddy / Fredbear, and we know that gender doesn't help answer their identity, let's finally talk about Cassidy and Andrew, the 2 main contestants. Starting with Cassidy. The name for Cassidy was found within the survival logbook by Reddit user DPowerful1. We know Cassidy definitely exists because of not only that, but because a scrapped FNAF movie script featured and was named Cassidy, to which Scott called this script the most accurate screenplay of the true story that would be satisfying to the most hardcore fans. Finally, the name Cassidy was introduced on the 1st of March 2018 in the survival logbook. Now, let's go to Andrew, who we learn about in the Fazbear Frights book Bunny Calls short story, The Man in Room 1280. The Man in Room 1280 is basically a representation of Ultimate Custom Night, that a spirit is keeping a man alive against everyone's attempts at killing him. But the man also showed signs of brain function, surprisingly representing REM sleep patterns, but only of horrific nightmares. And that's because Andrew is causing him to endure these nightmares endlessly. This is clearly representing Ultimate Custom Night, and makes us view it more as an endless nightmare produced by the one you should not have killed, other than being literal hell or purgatory of some sorts, which most people originally believed. Finally, the name and or existence of Andrew was introduced on the 1st of September 2020. Back to the identity itself, I'm more than sure it's Cassidy. You may have wondered why I kept referring to the date of introduction. That's because Ultimate Custom Night came out on the 27th of June 2018, only 3 months after Cassidy's introduction and 2 years before Andrew's introduction. The only valid reason people believe it might be Andrew is simply because of the fact some voice lines specifically call the spirit a male, But like I said before, that doesn't actually matter, and is only there to troll us with what their gender may be. And let's be real, if the man in room 1280 never came out, no one would have ever questioned the spirit's identity being Cassidy, and it would have never been a discussion. And like I said, that story came out 2 years ago after Ultimate Custom Night did. Do we really want to believe that Scott threw us a random fake name for the other spirit possessing Golden Freddy, literally just so he can reveal it was a troll 2 years later? The short story itself is a representation of Ultimate Custom Night for the books, so isn't Andrew just a representation of Cassidy for the books? This conclusion is without even touching upon or going into the entire debate about the Fazbear Frights being in a separate continuity within the FNAF canon, and an entirely different timeline than the games themselves, which is an unsolved mystery that I promise I have on the list to talk about another day. So in my opinion, the identity of the one you should not have killed, aka the Vengeful Spirit, aka Golden Freddy, is Cassidy. I would now consider the unsolved mystery of the one you should not have killed solved. There's a question that lingers in the back of everyone's minds when it comes to theory crafting and the general FNAF canon, and that question is about the amount of timelines within the FNAF universe. Between the main games, the book trilogy, the Fazbear Frights series, and Tales from the Pizzaplex series, there are a lot of things that connect and overlap between said universes, and a lot that don't. This has led some people to theorize that the Frights, or the Tales, or both, take place within the main game universe. They believe that the games and books aren't as separated as we think they are, as in to the point there's possibly 4 different timelines. So let's find out, within the FNAF universe, how many different timelines are there, and what is truly connected to the games. First of all, let's very quickly establish that there are different timelines within the FNAF universe in the first place, and that the book trilogy containing the Silver Eyes, the Twisted Ones, and the Fourth Closet are in a completely different timeline, 100%, no arguments there, which we know thanks to the Ultimate Guide, which states that there is a FNAF universe, and that the books simply introduced many elements that later appeared in the games. Without even touching the Ultimate Guide, and we already know that this trilogy is separate from the games due to literally everything that happens within it, namely the fact that Henry is dead before the books even begin. So with that out the way, and with us having established 2 different timelines 100%, it's time to tackle the 2 main questions. Are the Fazbear Frights and the Tales from the Pizzaplex connected to the game timeline? Well, the Fright series have had statements made about their canonicity to the game's timeline before, which we can assume the same applies for the Tales series, stating that they take place within the FNAF universe, and that each book contains 3 different short stories with unique characters and plot lines, some connected directly to the games and some not. Now, in the past, people have taken the some do some don't point to conclude that they are connected to the game timeline, as in stories such as the Man in Room 1280, which we talked about last time, and mainly the Stitch Wraith epilogues, although in the Ultimate Guide we get more information stating that the Fazbear Frights can provide a window into important concepts, characters, and technology. These elements can help resolve mysteries of the past or seed new things to come. The common theme between all of these quotes and quotes about the original trilogy is that they are providing a better view at the rules the FNAF universe abides by, while not being directly connected to the games. Although the quote earlier said that some are connected to the games, I personally feel that was in the context of the characters and plot lines, and not the entire stories themselves, such as what year the missing children's incident occurs, what Ultimate Custom Night realistically is in the real world, etc. Simply just important timestamps and details, which Scott referred to when talking about the story as a whole. Quote, "Let me at least say this, future games will look forward, but look to the novels to fill in some of the blanks to the past. The blanks being the years that things take place and how things generally work. The details, not the entire short story that those blanks are cleared up in. Still don't believe that they are separate timelines? Here's a quick fire round with important differences between the games and the Fright/Tales. In Into the Pit, the missing children's incident includes 6 children instead of the 5 we all know is the true amount. In The Man in Room 1280, Afton has both of his arms. But if the fire talked about in this story is the FNAF 6 fire, then Afton would only have 1. Something else about Afton's corpse is the fact that there's no talk about anything animatronic or robotic like with Afton's case, although we know in both both FNAF 3 and FNAF 6, his body is entangled and mixed with the suit itself, with a number of parts wrapping around the endoskeleton, etc. In Help Wanted, we learn that Steve Snodgrass, the indie game developer in the Tales series, was approached multiple times by Fazbear Entertainment in person, but we learn in the games from Tape Girl that Fazbear Entertainment and the indie game developer communicated to each other through emails. In Count the Ways, Funtime Freddy is in a random garage, fully operational, but withering away, implying this would be after Sister Location. This cannot happen because Funtime Freddy was scooped in Sister Location, leaving only its shell behind, and any consciousness or functionality from the robotic parts within it went to Enid and later Molten Freddy. In Coming Home, Susie has brown hair and brown eyes instead of her game counterpart having blonde hair and blue eyes. I saw someone say once, explain Remnant to someone when it was introduced without Fazbear Frights, and go on to use that as proof that they're in the same timeline. But the entire point of the books is to expand upon certain concepts, such as the concept of Remnant. The quote about the original trilogy explains the book's connections to the games the best. While the books are set in a separate continuity from the games, they are considered canon. Many concepts first introduced in the novels later took hold in the games, while concepts introduced in the games were sometimes expanded upon in the novels, meaning that the books are in their own continuity, aka timeline, from the games, but are canon to the larger and overall FNAF universe. The books tell you the rough guidelines and the rules of the FNAF universe itself, while remaining in their own timeline continuity in order to not affect the game's story. I will quickly mention though that the Tales from the Pizzaplex epilogues are still ongoing and aren't over yet, so they might be connected to the game timeline, only since they have no real connection to any of the short stories themselves and seem to be their own thing and more of a prologue to Security Breach, presumably the endoskeleton being Burntrap's endoskeleton, but that's a theory for another day. But for now, the Fazbear Frights do not take place in the same timeline as the games. The Tales from the Pizzaplex books do not take place in the same timeline as the games, although the Tales epilogues might take place in the same timeline as the games, which we'll learn more of soon. So I would now consider the unsolved mystery of FNAF's universe solved. The Shadow Animatronics, one of FNAF's biggest unsolved mysteries to this day that appear in FNAF 2, FNAF 3, FNAF 4, Ultimate Custom Night, and FNAF AR. They are such an odd addition to the story to the point people often ignore them on their channels. Sometimes entirely, even me. But today we stop ignoring and Shadow Freddy, and attempt to answer, to the best of our ability with the extremely little information we have, what are the Shadow Animatronics? Why do they act how they do in FNAF 3? Why is Nightmare directly connected? And what is the reason Shadow Bonnie returns in FNAF AR? Let's find out. Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie are introduced in FNAF 2 as secret Easter eggs, but seem to take on a more serious role in FNAF 3, appearing in the main story minigames, while also still secretly appearing in the office. Shadow Freddy on his own appears in FNAF 4 as Nightmare, who is outright called Shadow Freddy in the files, and they're both referenced slightly too in the minigames, but then they both do not return into Ultimate Custom Night as a fun secret antagonist. But then in FNAF AR, suddenly Shadow Bonnie seemingly takes center stage, having an entire portion of the main gameplay dedicated to them, and then also appearing in a short story in the Fazbear Frights series called Hide and Seek. Anything from then on is just an Easter egg or reference to the two. This leaves us with a lot of questions to answer, but with extremely limited information. And with that in mind, reminder that this is purely speculation and just my best guess with all the information we have so far. Let's begin with what the Shadow Animatronics are. We can't go this entire video without mentioning the most popular theory that arose from their first appearances, and was a pretty consistent theory until recently, which was that they were past employees who died from the springlock failures that we hear about in FNAF 3's Night 4 phone call.
After learning of an unfortunate incident at the sister location involving multiple and simultaneous spring lock failures, the company has deemed the suit temporarily unfit for employees,
and that they've been haunting the franchise ever since. Although that left the question of what their intentions would have been in the night end minigames in FNAF 3. Some say this could be referencing how they felt guilty and wanted to help guide the spirits in the right direction because they weren't able to stop the murders, etc. So obviously that whole theory was just reaching at straws because we had nothing else. But now we're quite a few years ahead and have a lot more lore and new ways that everything works, to the point that I think we can actually pinpoint their existence to something different, as well as Nightmare Nightmare's existence. For this though, let's skip ahead from their first appearances and go to their most recent appearance, FNAF AR. Did anyone else find this strange? This animatronic that wasn't even too relevant for years just suddenly shows up as a main centerpiece for its own gameplay section. Although when you actually start to look at what this entire section is about, you'll begin to know where I'm heading with this. In this section, it's basically a one-on-one with Shadow Bonnie that occurs after you collect too much Dark Remnant, and then you need to shine the flashlight on her multiple times until you win, blah 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 blah. This is quite an odd mechanic. Why does Shadow Bonnie appear after collecting too much Dark Remnant? An interesting point is written about Remnant in the Ultimate Guide, raising a good point that if Remnant is a conductor of emotion, it's possible that Bright Remnant forms from positive emotions, while Shadowy Remnant is formed from negative ones. So with this random inclusion in consideration, is it possible that Shadow Bonnie and Shadow Freddy are the ramifications of all the Remnant that have come from events such as the Missing Children's incident? We already know that Molten Freddy has the remnant of the Missing Children's incident already, so is it possible that there were more ramifications for their remnant than just that? Think about it. We know that the Shadow Animatronics existed before FNAF 2 even happened, due to them appearing in that game, which would make sense if they came from the Missing Children's incident, but it would also make sense considering FNAF 3's minigames, where they seem to guide the children into finding the killer after trying to find the killer for so many years, or just leading them into being freed from their suits, which all helps ultimately lead to William's defeat. They're never seen away from the children, always seemingly following them. Notice though that after the children are freed and William is defeated, they don't appear again. From then on, we only see references to them both, until Shadow Bonnie appears in FNAF AR, a questionably canon appearance, to connect the idea of Remnant to them, metaphorically showcasing how too much Dark Remnant leads to them, simply showing how the shadows came to be. They are the manifestations of the pain and agony of the souls trapped inside the animatronics, all ultimately forming a single entity. Although, what if it's not that they're both simply created from one of the Missing Children's incidents, but both incidents separately creating both entities? Shadow Freddy coming from the remnant of the original Missing Children's incident in 1985, possessing the original animatronics, while Shadow Bonnie coming from the remnant of the second incident, possessing the toy animatronics, that led to the creation of Shadow Bonnie. First of all, look at the timeline of each of them specifically. Both appear in FNAF 2, Shadow Bonnie looking more like the toy animatronic Toy Bonnie, while Shadow Freddy looks more like the original, aka the withered Golden Freddy. Not only do their looks hint at this difference, but the fact that Shadow Freddy only appears in parts and service, where the withered / originals resides, could further imply this difference. After FNAF 2 happens and the toys possessed by the second incident are eventually scrapped and turned to junk, we never see Shadow Bonnie canonically again after this point in the timeline, which would make sense if the second incident children are now finished with and freed. However, we canonically still see Shadow Freddy after they're scrapped, until the original suits possessed by the first incident are destroyed as well, which leads to us never seeing Shadow Freddy again after this point in the timeline, which seems to subtly imply that Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie are the manifestations of both separate incidents. Nightmare aka Shadow Freddy also only appears in FNAF 4 after we see the Nightmare versions of all the original 5 animatronics, which we're now theorizing led to Shadow Freddy, and in Ultimate Custom Night says, "I am your wickedness, made of flesh." Wickedness being defined as the quality of being evil or morally wrong, Shadow Freddy being William's evil, aka remnant from his killings. Finally, I want to mention Midnight Motorist and how some people believe the footprints to be the Shadow Animatronics. If you believe this theory, then that doesn't work though. If the crying child is the one heading to that place again, then that automatically puts this minigame in the pre-1983 years before he dies, which means the Shadow Animatronics could not be the missing children, unless we want to say that the missing children's incident happens in 1983 before he dies and not 1985, even though every single interpretation so far of said event has always set the date to 1985. So unless for some reason the incident takes place in 1983, unlike what recent sources are telling us, then the footprints cannot be from the Shadow Animatronics, like some people believe. More on Midnight Motorist in this video. So, what do you think? Shadow Freddy aka Nightmare being the remnant of the original Missing Children's incident, while Shadow Bonnie is the remnant of the second Missing Children's incident. I would now consider the unsolved mystery of Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie, the Shadow Animatronics, solved. The Ultimate Guide is basically the official FNAF handbook, full of all the information you need to know about the entire Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, written by Scott Cawthon after the inaccuracies of the Freddy files. Although fans and theorists alike claim that the Ultimate Guide is still inaccurate and that no one can use anything from it as proof or evidence for anything theory related. This video will be a little different as it's going to be split into multiple sections. I'm going to read the entire book again and then point out its flaws, what it fixes from the previous Freddy files, point out what it confirms, and ultimately come to a conclusion whether we can actually trust this book and use it for theory crafting. So let's begin. Let's start with the flaws. What are the actual things wrong with this book? And no, I'm not counting spelling or grammar mistakes. To learn this, I reread the entire book, as well as looked through videos from other creators to learn of any valid mistakes that I missed. Although before we begin, I need to make two giant clarifications out the way before anyone starts mentioning these in the comments. 1. Anything under the title of the fan theory sections or anything that specifically says fans believe or fans have said is not counted as a mistake, because they are genuine and legitimate theories from fans that sprung from these games. For example, obviously Purple Guy isn't Phone Guy, but the theory is mentioned here simply because that was literally the most popular and agreed upon theory back in the FNAF 2 days when we did actually think that he was holding a phone in the minigames. That doesn't mean that this book is now wrong because of it. It's literally just pointing out what was the most popular fan theory at the time. And I'm sure people are hopefully able to understand when it's under the label fan theories. Scott isn't saying it's true and confirming it by having it there, and clearly starting the paragraph with, there are a few theories circulating. 2. The illustrations are not counted as mistakes either, because the illustrations are mostly always wrong. And we've known that from the illustrations within the other books too, such as the Silver Eyes trilogy, the Fazbear Frights, and this book. So it's not that just this book's illustrations are wrong, the graphic novel illustrations within this franchise in general are wrong. So with that in mind, let's go over the validly pointed out mistakes within this book, and I'll explain my thoughts on why some mistakes have been made and debunk some others which are valid but have a reasoning behind them. First, Freddy and Chica are in the wrong places on the map in FNAF 1, technically. What I mean by that is that this map shows Bonnie left, Chica middle, and Freddy right, which staring at the show stage it would look to be the case, but if you actually look closer you can tell it's actually Bonnie left, Freddy middle, and then Chica right. So I think what happened here is that whoever made this map simply looked at the show stage and put their icons in that order, going left to right. Secondly, Golden Freddy has a purple hat here, despite it being black in FNAF 1. For this, I genuinely think that this is Scott's new Ultimate Custom Night model for either Golden Freddy itself, without its shadows, or Fredbear, because this feels like it was given by Scott himself, simply because searching up Golden Freddy head has literally every single one with a black hat on, and if you try and find this image, it doesn't come up with the exact image. So it doesn't seem like they just searched it up and got it from somewhere, because I literally just can't find this exact image anywhere. In the FNAF 2 section, it claims that 11 animatronics can either kill you or crash your game, which would be the Toys, Withers, Mangle, Puppet, Balloon Boy, and Golden Freddy. And then it goes on to mention 4 others, only there to fill your nightmares, as in not kill you, which would supposedly be JJ, Endo 2, Shadow Freddy, and Shadow Bonnie. But as we know, Shadow Bonnie is the one who crashes your game, so the book separating the characteristic from them is wrong. But as I'm writing this, I've realized that this actually isn't a mistake, because it's removing Balloon Boy from the 11 as he never actually kills you and puts Shadow Bonnie as the 11 instead. Next, in the Night End minigame section in FNAF 2, it constantly mentions how the game will crash after these cutscenes happen, which isn't true. But it also mentions how directly after this, a code will appear either being or it's me, showing how the game itself doesn't crash. So I think this is simply just mentioning how this is the crash, because it also mentions this for the other minigames that end the same way. As for the others mentioned, I'm not sure what the reasoning behind this one is. On the FNAF 3 intro page, it says that the game takes place 30 years after the events we're not sure of, but we know from the game's actual description that it's the FNAF 1 location closing, but the book seems to know that too a couple pages later. Next, it mentions how sister location takes place within Circus Baby's Pizza World instead of Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rentals, which we know as a fact. But to be fair, we know that the 30 years later thing came due to the game's description of FNAF 3, and in the game description of Sister Location, it welcomes you to Circus Baby's Pizza World, and that they are hiring a technician. So that's where I think the mistake was made. Now, all of these ones here, I really don't know what happened, but I'll tell you the mistakes anyway, which starts with the name Springtrap being used instead of it actually being Spring Bonnie in Stage 1 and in Fruity Maze. It also claims that Susie's story is further explored in Coming Home, despite that being Fazbear Frights' Susie and not Game Susie, which the rest of the paragraph was already talking about. The book states that this resembles Hercules Hospital, even though the poster actually says One Night at the Opera. Next, Ultimate Custom Night Scraptrap is noted as going through the top then, even though it's actually Springtrap. But then Scraptrap also appears in the correct position on the next page. On this same page though, there's another mistake. The puppet appears in the kitchen with Chica and not the prize corner. Next, Plush Trap apparently disappears when you click him, which is wrong as it will go away no matter what you click. Next, it mentions how the scooper is an extractor, but it's actually an injector, which we learn through the Pizzeria Simulator blueprints. It mentions how Ella was later mass produced, as in following the trilogy events, even though they're entirely separate. The last 5 mistakes are simply just the animatronic inventory section, either using the wrong picture or the appearances are wrong or just missing some, such as how Jacko Bonnie is not in Ultimate Custom Night, the picture for JJ is Balloon Boy, Nightmare Young is not in FNAF AR, the Withers are not listed to be in Curse of Dreadbear, and Eleanor is not listed to be in To Be Beautiful, its main story. So after some mistake hunting, we have 14 mistakes, which, removing animatronic appearances being wrong or missing, leaves us with a separate 10 actual mistakes within this 292 page book. Now, I quickly want to mention the fixes from the previous books, which is that it removed Michael from being Springtrap, FNAF 4 being in 1987, and Michael being the crying child, all removed due to people using its inclusion in the books, yes, even under the theory section, as evidence for some reason that it must be true, and making sure that they are completely debunked. Scott also made sure that Lefty being a device to capture children, and Elizabeth only possibly being William's daughter, were both removed too, as we know the 100% truth about both. So, is it trustable? Yes it is. Unlike the other Freddy Files books, Scott is confirmed to be directly and way more involved with this book, giving information on upcoming books as well. Scott was annoyed with the mistakes and or some of the inclusions within the other books, so why would he allow this to happen a third time? The current mistakes, like for example 30 years after events unknown, are simply things that he and us skimmed past and kept reading, unless you're intentionally trying to find mistakes. You wouldn't have realized it doesn't specifically say 30 years after Freddy's closing. There are a lot of times within this book where it specifically says fans should go look here to solve this, and this specifically tells us this, which were left in by Scott to help us. And also, these are some of the things that are confirmed within this book. The only reason Molten Freddy having the missing children's remnant is even a thing is because the Ultimate Guide specifically says it is a thing. So if people take that as fact now, no one can suddenly turn around and tell you that the books have no legitimacy when it comes to a theory that they just don't like. Because as we've seen, it is legit and is trustable. This is Springtrap and this is Scraptrap. These two designs are of the exact same character, but how did he repair his suit? How did his skull change color? Why does he have more teeth, his eyes, his feet? Scott Cawthon himself commented on the design change, saying that there is actually a lore reason to this. So obviously it's not just going to be the fire did this to him. So what is the reason? Well, today we're hopefully going to figure it out. So let's begin. The common theory for most people upon looking at the differences between Springtrap and Scraptrap is that it's simply some post-fire things, mostly due to the Ultimate Guide describing it simply as just a more worn version of Springtrap. But like I mentioned before, there are way too many differences for this to just happen. So what did happen? Well, for this we're going to have to travel to the books. Within the fourth closet we learn that there are 4 versions of Charlie: toddler, child, teenager, and adult. And we see with the adult version that she's able to turn herself into the baby animatronic we've always known, as in go from human to humanoid to full-on animatronic. How does she do this? With a mix of both illusion discs and remnant, which she uses to transform / morph her own body. We also see a similar thing happen in the Fazbear Frights, where Eleanor takes a pendulum which is made from and charged with remnant, and uses its powers of memory to shapeshift via remnant-induced illusions. I believe this is what's happening with Scraptrap. We can see Springtrap's old skull in Scraptrap's jump scare, so we know that it's the same corpse, but instead he's created something to sort of shell and protect his vulnerable corpse. corpse more, and also to fix up his suit a little bit. If he actually did repair his old suit or rebuilt it entirely, then there wouldn't be holes still, as it would be a completely new suit. But if it's something more supernatural, such as illusion discs and or remnant, then it's easier to understand why there are still holes and mistakes in the suit, and explain why not the entire body is fixed and returned back to proper spring body form. Also take into consideration that we know from what we found that the phantom animatronics are most likely created by Springtrap's agony, and Remnant being able to create them as hallucinations, instead of them just simply being hallucinations, which I think was their original purpose until recently, because we know that they aren't caused by ventilation problems, etc., because they don't appear directly after those problems. Instead, they cause those problems after appearing and attacking. So we know that Springtrap was actually able to make use of these sort of things while being in the Springtrap suit. So it's entirely possible he repurposed Remnant and Agony from the Phantoms into his own repairments and further protection for himself. Honestly though, I do think this is one of those things that don't really have an answer, nor matters too much. Honestly, for all we know, Springtrap just rebuilt himself and that's the lore reason, but I just thought that I should give you all this theory anyways, because who knows, it could be right, and there's no harm in just a theory. A game theory. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed Season 1 of FNAF Unsolved Mysteries. See you in Season 2 early next year.